The child's scream pierced through the thick humidity of the Everglades night as Evangeline's pale hand broke through the black water's surface, fingers wrapping around the small wrist just as the cypress roots threatened to drag the girl under forever. Chloe Mitchell, 8 years old, wearing a pink unicorn backpack now soaked with algae and swamp water, stared into eyes that glowed like Spanish moss in moonlight, into a face that was beautiful and terrible all at once, and the name tumbled from the witch's lips before the child could even draw breath to speak it. "Chloe," Evangeline whispered, her voice carrying the weight of 247 years of death and resurrection, of countless souls she'd claimed and countless more she'd saved. And in that moment, the girl saw what she truly was, saw the darkness that lived in her bones, the curse that made her more corpse than woman, more legend than flesh. The water around them began to bubble and hiss, steam rising as Evangeline's power fought against the ancient magic of the swamp itself, the place that had birthed her and damned her in the same breath back in 1776, when she'd made a bargain she couldn't unmake. Chloe's parents had been dead for 3 hours now, their car submerged 50 yards behind them, their names already whispered by the swamp before Evangeline had even known to come. And this child, this innocent thing with scraped knees and a missing front tooth, would either become another ghost story told around Floridian campfires, or she would become something else entirely, something Evangeline had never allowed herself to create in all these centuries of isolation and penance. The Spanish moss overhead swayed without wind, and Evangeline heard them coming, heard their names on the air like smoke signals from hell itself. Marcus Chen, Isabella Rodriguez, Samuel Turner, Darren Hayes, all of them drawn to this place by forces they couldn't understand, all of them carrying secrets that would either destroy them or set them free. And she knew, with the terrible certainty that came with her curse, that tonight the swamp would demand a price that would change everything. How did a monster become a savior? And could salvation ever truly wash away the blood of 2 centuries' worth of sins? If you connect with my story, please press the like button to find some light in this priest's heart. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next life stories, and tell me about them in the comments where you are watching this video and what time it is right now. It makes me very happy to know that from any corner of the country or the world you are listening to me. The thing about being dead for longer than you were alive is that you stop measuring time the way humans do. Evangeline Devereux had learned this truth somewhere between her 50th and 100th year of cursed existence, when the seasons began to blur together like watercolors left in the rain, when the faces of the living became as fleeting as mayflies dancing over the swamp's surface. She existed in the liminal space between breath and decay, her body preserved by magic so old it predated the founding of the nation itself, her heart still beating only because she'd traded her humanity for power she never wanted in the first place. The Everglades knew her name the way a mother knows her child, with intimate cruelty and possessive love, and she knew every name that entered its waters before their owners ever spoke them aloud. This gift, this curse, had made her a legend whispered about in bars from Homestead to Naples. The witch who could steal your soul just by knowing what to call you, the woman in white who appeared when the fog rolled in, thick and smelled of sulfur and jasmine. But legends rarely captured the loneliness of immortality, the weight of watching the world change while you remained frozen in the moment of your greatest mistake. And tonight, as she pulled a drowning child from the water that had birthed her into this half-life, Evangeline felt something she hadn't experienced in decades, the terrible, beautiful possibility of redemption. Evangeline carried the shivering child through water that parted for her like silk curtains, her bare feet finding purchase on submerged logs and hidden stones that would have broken a mortal's ankles, moving with the certainty of someone who'd walked these paths when they were still dry land, before the sea levels rose, and the developers came and the magic grew hungry. Chloe had stopped screaming but hadn't stopped staring, her small body rigid with terror and shock, and Evangeline could feel the girl's name resonating in her chest like a tuning fork, could taste the sweetness of her innocence the way a sommelier tastes notes of cherry and oak. The ability to know names had come with the curse, a twisted gift from the entity she'd summoned that night in 1776, when she'd been desperate and young and so stupidly in love with a British officer who'd promised her the world and delivered only ashes. She'd wanted power to make him stay, to make him choose her over his duty and his distant wife, and the swamp had answered with enthusiasm that should have warned her away. Instead of love, she'd gained immortality. Instead of companionship, she'd gained isolation. Instead of a future, she'd gained an endless present where every sunrise looked the same and every sunset promised nothing but more darkness. The cabin emerged from the mangroves like a fever dream, built on stilts that had stood for 200 years without rotting. Its walls hung with herbs and bones and things that glowed faintly in the dark, warding off both the curious and the malevolent. Evangeline climbed the rope ladder with Chloe clutched against her chest, the child's heartbeat thundering against her own sluggish pulse, and as she crossed the threshold, she felt the familiar tingle of her protective spells recognizing her, welcoming her home to this place that was both sanctuary and prison. She laid Chloe on the bed, a four-poster monstrosity carved from cypress and adorned with moth-eaten lace, and began stripping away the wet clothes with practiced efficiency, wrapping the girl in blankets that smelled of lavender and smoke. Chloe's eyes followed her every movement, wide and unblinking, and Evangeline knew the child was trying to reconcile what she'd seen in the water with what she was seeing now, trying to make sense of a woman who looked barely older than 30, but moved with the weight of centuries. "Your parents," Evangeline said softly, her voice carrying the faint traces of an accent that hadn't existed for 150 years, a blend of French and Spanish and something older, something that predated European colonization entirely. "I'm sorry, the swamp took them before I could reach them. She didn't explain how she'd known to come, how she'd felt the disturbance in the water the moment the Mitchells' rental car had left the highway and plunged into the canal, how she'd heard their names whispered by a wind that didn't exist. Chloe's lower lip trembled, and then she was crying, great heaving sobs that shook her small frame, and Evangeline found herself doing something she hadn't done in 70 years. She reached out and pulled another person into an embrace. The child clung to her like a drowning victim to driftwood, and Evangeline felt the unfamiliar sting of tears in her own eyes, salt water that had no business existing in a body that was more curse than flesh. The others arrived as the moon reached its zenith, their presence announced by the nervous calling of nightbirds and the sudden silence of bullfrogs. Evangeline felt their names blooming in her consciousness like dark flowers. Marcus Chen, 42, architect from Miami, running from a fraud investigation and a crumbling marriage. Isabella Rodriguez, 19, university dropout with a gift for seeing the dead that had driven her to the edge of madness. Samuel Turner, 67, retired detective with stage 4 cancer and 6 months to live. Darren Hayes, 29, documentary filmmaker obsessed with proving the existence of the supernatural. They came in a single John boat, its motor struggling against currents that shouldn't exist this far from open water, drawn by the same inexplicable pull that had brought them all to the Everglades on this specific night at this specific hour. Evangeline watched them from her window, her fingers tracing patterns in the condensation on the glass, and she knew with the terrible certainty of her curse that the swamp had called them here for a purpose, that their fates were tangled together like the roots beneath the water, and that before the night was through at least one of them would die. She'd seen this pattern before, recognized the signature of the entity that had cursed her, the ancient thing that lived in the deepest part of the swamp, where the water turned black as ink and the air itself felt thick with malevolence. It collected souls the way children collected fireflies, drawn to moments of crisis and desperation, feeding on the energy of human suffering. Every decade or so, it would orchestrate gatherings like this, bringing together people whose lives were balanced on knife edges, whose decisions could tip toward darkness or light, and it would offer them bargains dressed up as salvation. Evangeline had spent the last century trying to interfere with these collections, saving those she could, easing the passage of those she couldn't, earning the entity's displeasure and her own continued existence in equal measure. She was its greatest success and its greatest failure, proof that its gifts could last forever, and evidence that immortality without purpose was just another form of damnation. Marcus was the first to call out, his voice carrying across the water with the desperate edge of a man who'd run out of options. "Hello, is anyone there? We need help." His Mandarin-accented English marked him as second generation, his expensive hiking boots and designer jacket, marking him as someone unprepared for the reality of the Everglades at night. Isabella sat in the center of the boat, her dark eyes seeing things the others couldn't. Her fingers pressed against her temples as if trying to push back against the visions that crowded her mind. Samuel had his hand on an old service revolver, his weathered face set in the grim expression of a man who'd seen too much violence to trust in coincidence. Darren held a camera that was still recording despite the water damage, his enthusiasm barely dimmed by their dire circumstances, his belief in the supernatural about to be confirmed in ways he couldn't possibly imagine. Evangeline descended the ladder with fluid grace, her white dress, the same one she'd been wearing the night of her transformation, preserved by magic and stubbornness, billowing around her legs like smoke. She stepped onto the water, and it held her weight, a trick she'd learned in her first 50 years, and the boat's occupants gasped in unison. "Marcus Chen," she said, meeting his eyes across the distance. "Isabella Rodriguez, Samuel Turner, Darren Hayes." She spoke their names like an incantation, like a judge reading sentences, and she watched the color drain from their faces as they realized she shouldn't know who they were, that something fundamentally wrong was happening here. "You shouldn't have come to this place. The swamp doesn't give back what it takes." Marcus stood up too quickly, nearly capsizing the boat, his hand reaching instinctively for a phone that would have no signal out here, even if it weren't soaked through. "How do you know our names? Who are you?" The panic in his voice was understandable. He'd fled Miami thinking he could disappear into the wilderness, never imagining he'd find something worse than federal prosecutors waiting for him. Isabella was staring at Evangeline with recognition that went deeper than surprise, her gift allowing her to see the death that clung to the witch like a second skin, the countless spirits that orbited her like moons around a dark planet. Samuel had drawn his gun but hadn't raised it yet, his cop instincts warring with something deeper, some fundamental understanding that weapons meant for the living would do nothing against what stood before them. It was Darren who found his voice next, his filmmaker's mind racing to document, even as his survival instinct screamed warnings. "You're her, the witch of the Everglades, the one who knows names. Jesus Christ, you're real." His camera was up now, focusing on her face, and Evangeline felt the old familiar anger rise in her chest, the resentment of being reduced to folklore, to a story told to scare tourists. But beneath the anger was something else, something that had been growing since she'd pulled Chloe from the water. Curiosity about what might happen if she stopped hiding, if she let these people see her not as a monster, but as what she truly was, a woman who'd made a mistake and had spent 2.5 centuries trying to atone for it. "You're all here because you made a choice," Evangeline said, her voice carrying across the water with unnatural clarity. "You asked for something, prayed for something, wished for something in a moment of desperation, and the swamp heard you." She moved closer, walking on water that should have swallowed her, and the John boat drifted toward her as if pulled by invisible strings. "Marcus, you wanted to disappear, to escape the consequences of your actions. Isabella, you wanted the visions to stop, to have silence in your mind. Samuel, you wanted more time, a chance to solve one last case. Darren, you wanted proof, evidence that would make your career and validate your obsessions." She was close enough now to see the fear in their eyes, the recognition of truth they hadn't voiced even to themselves. "The swamp is prepared to give you what you want, but the price will be everything you are." The water beneath them began to glow with bioluminescence that didn't come from any natural source. Green and purple lights swirling like oil on the surface, and from the depths came a sound like breathing, like the inhalation of some massive lung. The entity was close, closer than it had been in years, drawn by the concentration of desperation and desire. Evangeline had felt it stirring for days, had known this night was coming, but she'd hoped to have more time to prepare, to understand what the swamp wanted from this particular gathering. Now, standing between these 4 lost souls and the thing that had damned her, she realized that maybe this wasn't about them at all. Maybe after 247 years, the entity had finally come to collect on the debt she'd never finished paying. Isabella spoke, her voice barely a whisper but carrying the weight of genuine terror. "I can see them, the dead, they're everywhere here, hundreds of them, thousands, all the people who came before us, all the ones who took the bargain." Her hands were shaking, and Evangeline recognized the glazed look in her eyes, the expression of someone whose gift had become a curse, who could no longer distinguish between the living and the departed. The girl was young, so painfully young, the same age Evangeline had been when she'd stood in this very swamp, and summoned something she couldn't control. "They're trying to warn us. They're screaming at us to leave." "They're right," Evangeline said, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt genuine fear. Not for herself. She'd lost the ability to fear her own death somewhere around her 100th birthday, but for these people who'd stumbled into a trap they couldn't see. "Whatever brought you here, whatever you think you want, it isn't worth what you'll lose." She reached out and grabbed the bow of the John boat, her fingers leaving marks in the aluminum that glowed faintly before fading. "There's a child in my cabin. Chloe Mitchell, 8 years old, orphaned 3 hours ago when the swamp took her parents. I'm going to get her to safety, get her back to civilization where people with normal lives and beating hearts can care for her. You should come with me, now, before the offer expires." But even as she said it, Evangeline knew they wouldn't listen. She could see it in their eyes. The same stubborn hope that had doomed her. The belief that they were different, that the rules didn't apply to them, that they could take what they wanted without paying the price. Marcus was already shaking his head, his mind calculating odds and escape routes, convinced he could outsmart whatever forces were at work. Darren's camera was still recording, capturing everything, his journalistic instinct overriding his common sense. Samuel touched the place over his heart where the cancer grew, and Evangeline saw the resignation in his face, the willingness to gamble everything because he'd already lost what mattered most. Only Isabella seemed to understand the danger, but her gift trapped her, showed her things that made the present seem less terrifying than the future she could see unfolding. The swamp surged beneath them, and the John boat tipped, throwing all 4 occupants into water that had gone from warm to freezing in an instant. Evangeline dove without thinking, her body moving with supernatural speed, and she caught Isabella and Marcus, dragging them toward the shallow ground near her cabin. Samuel and Darren were already swimming, their survival instincts kicking in despite the shock, and within minutes all 4 were dragging themselves onto the small island of relatively dry land where Evangeline's home stood like a lighthouse against the darkness. They collapsed, gasping and shivering, and Evangeline stood over them like a guardian angel carved from marble and moonlight, her white dress untouched by the water that soaked through their clothes. "The cabin is warded," she said, her voice brooking no argument. "You'll be safe there until dawn. After that, I'll guide you back to the highway, back to your lives, and you'll forget this place ever existed." She knew it was a lie, even as she spoke it. The swamp never forgot, and neither would they. But she needed them calm, needed them to trust her long enough to survive the night. The entity was circling now. She could feel it in the way the air pressure dropped and rose in rhythmic cycles, could taste its anticipation like copper on her tongue. It wanted something specific from this gathering, and until Evangeline understood what that was, she couldn't protect them. She helped them up the ladder one by one. Marcus first because he was the weakest swimmer, Isabella next because the visions were making her clumsy, Samuel third despite his protests that he should go last, and Darren bringing up the rear with his waterproof case clutched against his chest like a talisman. Inside the cabin, Chloe sat up in bed, her eyes red from crying but alert, watchful, and when she saw the others, she did something Evangeline didn't expect. She smiled. It was a small tentative thing, the smile of a child who'd been alone in her grief and was relieved to see other living souls, and it struck Evangeline like a physical blow. This was what she'd lost, what the curse had taken from her, the simple human comfort of shared suffering, the knowledge that darkness was easier to bear when you didn't face it alone. The 6 of them stood in the main room of the cabin, an odd congregation of the desperate and the damned, and Evangeline felt the weight of their names pressing against her chest like stones. Outside, the swamp continued its ancient song, and in the distance, thunder rumbled despite the clear sky, a warning of storms both natural and otherwise. She moved to the stove, an old cast-iron thing that predated electricity, and began heating water for tea, performing the domestic ritual with hands that remembered when such tasks were her daily routine, before magic had made her something other than human. The others watched her with varying degrees of suspicion and awe, and she knew they were all asking themselves the same question. Was she their salvation, or just another part of the trap? Marcus was the first to break the silence, his analytical mind trying to impose order on chaos. Okay, let's all just calm down and think rationally. There has to be an explanation for this that doesn't involve magic or curses or whatever. He looked around the cabin, taking in the dried herbs hanging from the rafters, the jars of mysterious substances lining the shelves, the symbols carved into every wooden surface. Maybe we're all experiencing some kind of mass hallucination, swamp gas or contaminated water or maybe, Isabella interrupted, her voice sharp with the edge of someone who'd spent too long being told her experiences weren't real. You should shut up and listen to the woman who just walked on water and knew all our names. She was sitting next to Chloe on the bed, her arm around the child in a protective gesture that reminded Evangeline of the girl she'd been before the visions started, before the dead had begun demanding her attention. "I can see you," Isabella said, looking directly at Evangeline. "Not just what you look like, but what you are. You're covered in death. It clings to you like a second skin. But underneath all that darkness, there's something else. Something that's trying to be good." Evangeline set down the teapot with a hand that trembled slightly, surprised by the accuracy of Isabella's perception. "I was 27 when I died," she said quietly, speaking words she hadn't voiced in decades. "It was 1776, and I was in love with a man who could never truly be mine. I came to this swamp looking for power to make him stay, to change his heart, to rewrite fate itself." She poured tea into mismatched cups, the steam rising like spirits in the candlelight. "Instead, I found something that offered me immortality, eternal youth, the ability to know the true names of anyone I met. It seemed like a gift at the time. It took me 50 years to understand it was a sentence." Samuel accepted a cup with a nod of thanks, his detective's mind cataloguing every detail, filing it away for later analysis. "And this thing that cursed you, it's what brought us here tonight." It wasn't a question. It's still out there, still making deals with desperate people, still destroying lives. "Yes," Evangeline confirmed, sitting down in a rocking chair that creaked with age and use. "It feeds on desperation, on the energy released when someone makes a choice that fundamentally alters their existence. It especially loves the moment when they realize what they've done, when the weight of their decision crashes down on them. That's when the flavor of their soul is most intense, most nourishing." She met each of their eyes in turn, forcing them to see the truth in her face. "You were all at that precipice tonight, all of you balanced on the edge of a choice that would define the rest of your lives. The entity doesn't care if you choose light or darkness. It feeds on the transformation itself, on the death of who you were and the birth of who you'll become." Darren had his camera out again, filming everything, and Evangeline didn't stop him. Let him document this, she thought. Let him take this evidence back to the world. Show them that monsters were real and mercy was rarer than magic. "Why don't you leave?" he asked, his filmmaker's instinct driving him to ask the questions others were thinking. If you hate what you are, if you've been trapped here for over 2 centuries, why not just walk away? The world is a big place. Surely you could find somewhere that the curse doesn't reach. "I tried," Evangeline admitted, her voice carrying the weight of countless failures. "In the early years I ran, made it as far as Virginia once, Boston another time, but the curse always pulled me back, dragged me through fever dreams and waking nightmares until I returned to the swamp. The entity and I are bound, predator and prey locked in an eternal dance, and the only way to break that bond is for one of us to die." She smiled without humor. "Since I can't die and it's never been alive in any way we'd understand, we're at an impasse." Chloe had been quiet through all of this, her child's mind processing horrors no 8-year-old should have to comprehend, but now she spoke, her voice small but clear. "My mommy said that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is ask for help. She said that nobody can do everything alone." She looked at Evangeline with eyes that had seen her parents die and seen a witch walk on water, and somehow still held hope. "Maybe you can't leave because you're trying to do everything by yourself. Maybe you need friends to help you be brave." The simplicity of it, the pure childish logic, hit Evangeline harder than any philosophical argument could have. She'd spent 247 years alone, convinced that isolation was her penance, that she deserved the loneliness that came with immortality. But what if Chloe was right? What if the real curse wasn't the magic, or the endless life, or even the knowing of names? What if it was the belief that she had to face it all alone? She looked at the 5 people gathered in her cabin, these strangers brought together by forces beyond their control, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt something that might have been hope stirring in her chest. The moment shattered as the cabin shook, the entire structure groaning as if caught in a hurricane despite the still air outside. The protective wards flared to life, symbols carved into wood glowing with blue-white light, and Evangeline was on her feet instantly, moving to the window. The swamp had transformed, the water now reflecting a sky full of stars that didn't exist in any earthly constellation, and rising from the depths came a figure that hurt to look at directly, a shape that was sometimes human and sometimes something else entirely, its form shifting and flowing like water given terrible purpose. The entity had grown tired of waiting, tired of circling, and now it had come to collect what it believed was owed. "Get away from the windows," Evangeline commanded, her voice carrying an authority that made everyone obey without question. "The wards will hold, but don't test them. Don't let any part of your body cross the threshold." She moved through the cabin with practiced efficiency, reinforcing the protective spells, burning herbs that filled the air with acrid smoke, speaking in a language that predated English and Spanish, that came from the original people who'd understood the swamp's true nature. The entity pressed against her defenses like a tide against a seawall, and she could feel its hunger, its rage at being denied, its determination to claim at least one soul before the night was through. Marcus backed into a corner, his rational mind finally breaking under the weight of undeniable supernatural evidence, his hands shaking as he pulled out his phone and stared at the screen that showed no signal, no connection to the world he understood. Isabella was on her knees, her hands pressed against her ears, as if trying to block out sounds only she could hear, the spirits of the swamp's victims all crying out in warning and despair. Samuel had his gun drawn now, pointed at the door, his military training taking over even though he knew bullets would be useless against what waited outside. Darren was still filming, his camera capturing everything, his face a mixture of terror and exhilaration as his life's work was validated in the most horrifying way possible. And Chloe stood at the center of them all, her small hand reaching for Evangeline's, her trust absolute despite everything she'd witnessed. The entity spoke, and its voice was thunder and whisper, seduction and threat, everything anyone had ever wanted to hear and everything they'd most feared. It called to Marcus, promising him invisibility, a new identity, freedom from consequence. It called to Isabella, offering silence, an end to the visions, peace in her tortured mind. It called to Samuel, dangling the prospect of healing, of years added to months, of time to make amends. It called to Darren, presenting ultimate proof, fame, validation, everything his career had been building toward. And it called to Chloe, speaking in her mother's voice, promising reunion, promising that death wasn't the end, that she could see her parents again if she'd just step outside. But most of all it called to Evangeline, and its voice for her was gentle, almost loving, the tone of a parent addressing a wayward child. It reminded her of the British officer, of the night she'd summoned it, of the bargain she'd made and the price she'd agreed to pay. It told her that she'd been fighting for so long, resisting for centuries, when she could simply surrender and find peace. It promised her that if she gave it these 5 souls, if she stopped interfering in its collections, it would release her from the curse, would let her finally die, would grant her the oblivion she'd been seeking for over 200 years. Evangeline felt the temptation like a physical thing, a weight pressing down on her shoulders, a seductive whisper in her ear. How easy it would be to open the door, to step aside, to let the entity take what it wanted. These people were strangers, their lives already forfeit the moment they'd called out to the swamp in their desperation. What were 5 more souls added to the thousands she'd already failed to save? What was their suffering compared to her own, stretched across centuries, infinite and unchanging? She could finally rest. She could finally stop fighting. She could finally let go. But then Chloe squeezed her hand. the child's fingers small and warm and alive against her own cold skin, and Evangeline looked down into eyes that still held hope, despite everything, that still believed in the possibility of tomorrow. She thought of Isabella, so young and terrified and gifted with sight, that could be a blessing if someone taught her how to control it. She thought of Marcus, running from mistakes he could still fix if given the chance. She thought of Samuel, dying but not dead, still capable of doing good in the time he had left. She thought of Darren, whose obsession with proof had brought him to the edge of destruction, but whose documentation might save others from the same fate. And she thought of herself at 27, standing in the swamp with her heart full of love and her head full of foolish hope, making a choice she couldn't unmake, becoming something she'd never intended to be. "No," Evangeline said, and her voice rang out clear and strong, cutting through the entity's seduction like a blade through silk. "Not tonight, not ever again. These souls are under my protection, and you cannot have them." She released Chloe's hand gently and walked to the door, her white dress glowing in the light of the protective wards, and she placed both palms against the wood, channeling every ounce of power she possessed into the barrier between the living and the damned. "I am Evangeline Marie Devereux, born March 12, 1749, cursed September 21, 1776, and I have spent 247 years paying for one moment of weakness. But I am done. I am done being your instrument, done standing aside while you destroy the desperate and the lost. If you want them, you'll have to go through me first." The entity's rage was palpable, a wave of fury that made the cabin shake and the wards flicker, and for a moment Evangeline thought they would fail, thought the protection she'd built over centuries would crumble under the assault. But then she felt hands on her shoulders, Marcus on one side, Samuel on the other, and their living warmth flowed into her, bolstering her strength. Isabella joined them, her gift allowing her to channel the energy of the protective spirits that lingered around the cabin, the ghosts of those Evangeline had saved over the years, lending their power to hers. Darren set down his camera and added his hands to the pile, his belief in the supernatural now absolute, his faith in Evangeline's goodness outweighing his fear. And Chloe, brave little Chloe, wrapped her arms around Evangeline's waist and held on tight, her innocent trust worth more than all the magic in the world. Together the six of them stood against the entity, their combined will forming a wall stronger than any Evangeline could have built alone, and slowly, reluctantly, the presence outside began to recede. It didn't retreat entirely, it never would, bound to this place as it was, but it pulled back, accepting that this night at least its prey would escape. The stars in the water faded back to normal constellations, the pressure in the air normalized, and the swamp resumed its usual chorus of frogs and insects and rustling leaves. The crisis had passed, but Evangeline knew it wasn't over. The entity would return, would test her defenses again, would keep trying to collect what it believed it was owed. But for the first time in 2.5 centuries, she wouldn't be facing it alone. Dawn came slowly to the Everglades, light creeping through the mist like a thief returning stolen goods, and Evangeline sat on her porch, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. Behind her, in the cabin, the others slept fitfully, exhausted by terror and revelation, their lives forever changed by a night that had shown them the truth beneath the world's surface. She knew she should wake them, should guide them back to civilization as she'd promised, but she found herself reluctant to break the spell of this moment, this brief peace before the complications of the waking world returned. Chloe emerged first, the resilience of childhood allowing her to bounce back faster than the adults, and she climbed into Evangeline's lap without hesitation, a gesture of trust that made the witch's dead heart ache with emotions she'd thought lost forever. "Are you going to stay here?" Chloe asked, her head resting against Evangeline's shoulder with the easy affection of a child who'd already decided they were friends. "In the swamp, all alone?" Evangeline considered the question, weighing centuries of habit against the events of the previous night, against the feel of hands on her shoulders and the strength of standing with others instead of apart from them. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice soft in the morning quiet. "I've been here so long that I don't remember how to be anywhere else, but maybe it's time I learned." She looked down at the child, at the trust and hope in those young eyes, and made a decision that terrified her more than facing the entity ever had. Would you like me to come with you? To make sure you get somewhere safe, somewhere with people who can take care of you properly? Chloe's smile was radiant, transforming her tear-stained face into something luminous, and she nodded enthusiastically. Yes, and you can meet my aunt in Orlando. She's nice. She makes the best chocolate chip cookies in the whole world. The simple domesticity of it, the mundane detail of cookies in a conversation about supernatural curses and ancient entities, made Evangeline laugh, a sound that surprised her with its genuine warmth. When was the last time she'd laughed? When was the last time she'd allowed herself to think about chocolate chip cookies and aunts and the ordinary goodness of human life? The others emerged gradually, drawn by the smell of coffee that Evangeline had brewed on her ancient stove, and they gathered on the porch like survivors of a shipwreck, grateful to have made it through the night but unsure what came next. Marcus looked different in the morning light, some of the desperate edge gone from his eyes, replaced by a thoughtfulness that suggested he was reconsidering his choices. Isabella sat close to Evangeline, her gift still active but less overwhelming in the daylight, and she kept glancing at the witch with a mixture of awe and kinship, recognizing a fellow outcast who'd learned to live with abilities that set her apart. Samuel had his phone out, making notes in a document that Evangeline suspected would become his final case file, his detective's mind already working on how to explain the unexplainable. Darren was reviewing his footage, his hands shaking slightly as he saw confirmation of everything he'd filmed, evidence that would either make his career or get him committed to a psychiatric facility. So, what happens now? Marcus asked, voicing the question they were all thinking. We just go back to our lives and pretend none of this happened. Pretend we didn't see a witch walk on water and stand against a demon. Not a demon, Evangeline corrected gently. Something older than demons, something that existed before humans had names for such things. But yes, essentially, you go back to your lives. You make different choices than the ones that brought you here. You live. She stood, moving to lean against the porch railing, looking out over the swamp that had been her prison and her home for so long. The entity will remember you, will always know your names, but if you stay away from places like this, if you resist the temptation to bargain with forces you don't understand, you should be safe. And you? Isabella asked, her voice carrying genuine concern. What about you? Are you just going to stay here, fighting this thing alone for another 200 years? Evangeline turned to face them, and in her expression they could see the internal battle raging, centuries of isolation and self-imposed penance warring against the possibility of something different, something that looked almost like hope. I made a promise to Chloe, she said slowly, each word feeling like a step into unknown territory. I'm going to make sure she gets to her aunt safely. After that, she trailed off, uncertainty showing through the cracks in her ancient confidence. After that, I suppose we'll see. Maybe it's time I learned what the world looks like beyond the Everglades. Maybe it's time I stopped running from what I am and started figuring out what I could be. Samuel stood, his movements carrying the stiffness of age and illness, but also a determination that suggested he'd found new purpose. I spent 30 years as a cop, solving crimes, putting pieces together. This thing you're fighting, this entity, there has to be a way to defeat it. Maybe not destroy it, but contain it, keep it from hurting anyone else. He met Evangeline's eyes with the steady gaze of someone who'd seen evil and hadn't flinched. You've been fighting alone for too long. What if you didn't have to? What if there was a team, people who knew the truth, who could help you protect others from making the same mistakes we almost made? The suggestion hung in the air like morning mist, shimmering with possibility and danger in equal measure. Evangeline felt something unfamiliar stirring in her chest, something that might have been excitement, or might have been terror at the thought of abandoning the isolation she'd clung to for so long. You don't know what you're offering, she warned, but her voice lacked conviction. The entity isn't the only supernatural threat in this world. There are things in the darkness that would tear you apart, just for knowing they exist. Getting involved in this life, in my life, it's a death sentence. I've already got a death sentence, Samuel reminded her with a wry smile, touching the place over his heart where the cancer grew. 6 months, maybe less. I'd rather spend that time doing something that matters than sitting in a hospital waiting to die. I'm already seeing the dead, Isabella added, her voice carrying a strength it had lacked the night before. "At least if I'm working with you, maybe I can learn to control it, to use it for something good instead of letting it drive me crazy." Marcus hesitated longer, his practical nature warring with the evidence of his own eyes, but finally he nodded. "I'm going to have to face the consequences of what I did in Miami eventually. But until then I have skills, architecture, design, problem-solving. If there are more places like this, more people at risk, maybe I can help build protections, create safe spaces." Darren was already nodding enthusiastically, his camera once again raised and recording. "Think of the documentary potential. Not exploitative, but educational, warning people about the real dangers, teaching them to recognize the signs of supernatural predation. We could save lives." His enthusiasm was infectious, and despite herself, Evangeline felt a smile tugging at her lips. "This is insane," she said, but there was no heat in the words, only wonder. "You're all talking about hunting monsters and fighting ancient evil like it's a career change instead of a suicide mission." "Says the woman who's been doing it solo for 2.5 centuries, Isabella pointed out with a grin. "At least we'll have each other's backs. That's got to count for something." And it did count for something, Evangeline realized. It counted for everything. She'd spent so long believing that her curse made her a solitary creature, that immortality meant eternal loneliness, that the only way to protect people was to keep them at a distance. But these 5 strangers, brought together by desperation and danger, had shown her a different possibility. They'd stood with her against the entity, had lent their strength to hers, had chosen to stay when running would have been so much easier. Maybe, just maybe, redemption wasn't something you earned alone in the darkness. Maybe it was something you built together, brick by brick, choice by choice, day by day. "Okay," Evangeline heard herself saying, the word feeling like a leap off a cliff into unknown waters. "Okay, we'll try this. But we do it smart. We learn everything we can about what's out there. We train, we prepare. No more desperate bargains, no more rushing in blind. We build something sustainable, something that will outlast all of us." She looked at Samuel, acknowledging the terminal nature of his condition, even as she respected his choice to spend his remaining time fighting. "And we protect each other. That's the first rule and the last rule. We protect each other, no matter what." The 6 of them spent the rest of the morning making plans, their voices rising and falling like a strange new kind of music in the cabin that had been silent for so long. They talked about logistics and research, about creating a database of supernatural threats and establishing safe houses across Florida. Marcus sketched designs for protective structures that could be erected quickly, incorporating the symbols and wards Evangeline had learned over centuries. Isabella described her visions in detail, helping Samuel construct a profile of supernatural activity patterns. Darren catalogued his footage, creating an archive that would serve as evidence and warning. And Chloe, in the way of children, sat in the middle of it all and drew pictures of the family she'd lost, and the strange new family she was finding. Her resilience a testament to the human capacity for hope, even in the darkest circumstances. By noon they were ready to leave, the John boat repaired through a combination of Marcus's practical skills and Evangeline's magic, provisioned with supplies from the cabin that Evangeline was surprised to realize she might never see again. She took one last look at the structure that had been her home for longer than most nations had existed, at the wards and protections she'd built with her own hands, at the sanctuary that had also been her cage. Part of her wanted to stay, to cling to the familiar, even if the familiar meant loneliness and endless repetition. But a larger part, the part that had felt Chloe's hand in hers and heard the others plan a future that included her, knew it was time to go. The swamp seemed to watch them as they navigated toward the highway, the water still and glassy, reflecting a sky that looked almost peaceful. Evangeline sat in the bow, her white dress pristine despite the mud and water, her hand trailing in the current that had birthed and cursed her. She could feel the entity's presence, a watchful malevolence lurking in the depths, but it didn't interfere, didn't try to stop their departure. Perhaps it knew what she was beginning to understand, that she wasn't leaving, not really. She was expanding, growing beyond the boundaries she'd set for herself, but the swamp would always be part of her, and she would always return to face what waited in its heart. The difference now was that she wouldn't be alone when she did. They reached the highway as the sun climbed toward its apex, the modern world reasserting itself with the roar of distant traffic and the buzz of power lines overhead. A gas station sat at the edge of the wilderness, its neon signs garish after the subtle beauty of the Everglades, and they pulled the John boat up onto the bank with the kind of mundane difficulty that felt surreal after the night's supernatural terrors. Evangeline stepped onto the concrete parking lot and felt the curse resist, felt the pull of the swamp trying to drag her back, but she pushed against it with a will hardened by centuries of endurance. She took one step, then another, and with each footfall she claimed a little more freedom, proved that maybe, just maybe, the rules that had governed her existence could be rewritten. Marcus went inside to call for help, to arrange transportation, and begin the complicated process of returning Chloe to her family, of figuring out how to explain what had happened without sounding completely insane. Isabella and Samuel stood guard, their newfound awareness of supernatural threats making them see potential danger in every shadow. Darren was already editing footage on his laptop, creating a rough cut that would become the foundation of something bigger. And Evangeline sat with Chloe on a bench outside the gas station, the child's head resting against her shoulder, both of them exhausted and transformed, and strangely hopeful. "Will I see you again?" Chloe asked, her voice small but certain that she wanted the answer to be yes. "You will," Evangeline promised, and she meant it with every fiber of her cursed being. "I'll make sure you get to your aunt, and then I'll visit. Regular visits, like a normal person." The words felt strange in her mouth, the concept of normalcy so foreign after centuries of isolation, but also right in a way she hadn't experienced since before the curse took hold. "And when you're older, if you want, I can teach you about what's really out there in the darkness, how to protect yourself, how to recognize danger, how to survive." "Will you teach me magic?" Chloe asked, with the innocent enthusiasm of a child who'd seen the impossible and wanted to understand it. Evangeline laughed, the sound carrying genuine warmth. "Maybe, when you're much, much older. For now, let's focus on getting you home, getting you back to school and friends and all the normal things 8-year-olds should be worrying about." She paused, then added quietly, "And Chloe, your parents loved you very much. What happened to them wasn't your fault, and it wasn't part of some grand plan. Sometimes terrible things just happen. But you get to choose what comes next. You get to decide whether that terrible thing defines you, or whether you use it to become stronger, kinder, braver." The child nodded solemnly, processing wisdom beyond her years, with the remarkable adaptability of youth. "I think I want to be brave, like you. Fighting monsters and protecting people. That seems like a good way to remember Mommy and Daddy." "That's a very good way to remember them," Evangeline agreed, her dead heart somehow feeling fuller than it had in centuries. "But remember that being brave doesn't mean not being scared. It means being scared and doing the right thing anyway. It means asking for help when you need it, and offering help to others when they need you. It means standing up even when you want to hide, and keeping going even when everything tells you to give up." Marcus emerged from the gas station with news that Chloe's aunt was on her way, that social services had been contacted, that the machinery of normal life was grinding into motion to catch this child before she fell through the cracks. He also had information about the car accident, about how the Mitchells had swerved to avoid a deer and ended up in the canal, about how rescue teams had been searching all night and would be relieved to know Chloe had survived. The official story was already being written, one that involved a lucky rescue by a local guide, no mention of witches or curses or entities that fed on desperation. Evangeline was fine with that. Some truths needed to stay in the shadows, at least for now. The waiting was strange, suspended in the liminal space between the supernatural and the mundane, and the 6 of them sat together sharing gas station coffee and stale donuts that tasted like the most exquisite feast after the previous night's terror. They talked about ordinary things, favorite movies, childhood memories, places they'd traveled, and in doing so, they became something more than just fellow survivors. They became friends, or at least the beginning of friendship, bound together by shared trauma and shared purpose. Evangeline found herself telling stories from centuries past, edited for modern sensibilities, but carrying the essential truth of her long existence, and the others listened with rapt attention, asking questions that showed they wanted to understand, to know her as more than just a supernatural being, but as a person with history and regrets and hopes for the future. When Chloe's aunt arrived, a warm-faced woman in her 40s with the same dark curls and bright eyes as the child, the reunion was bittersweet. Joy at finding Chloe alive mixed with grief for her sister's death, and Evangeline stood back, watching the normal human emotions play out, feeling like an outsider even as Isabella's hand found hers and squeezed in solidarity. But then Chloe was pulling her forward, introducing her as the lady who saved me. And suddenly Evangeline was being hugged by a grateful aunt who smelled like lavender and tears, being thanked in words that felt inadequate for what had actually transpired, but were sincere in their simple humanity. "I don't know how to repay you," the aunt said. Her name was Jennifer, and she worked as a teacher in Orlando, normal facts that grounded the moment in blessed ordinariness. "If there's anything at all, just take care of her," Evangeline interrupted gently. "Love her, keep her safe, help her heal. That's payment enough." She knelt down to Chloe's level, looking the child in the eyes one last time. "Remember what I told you about being brave, and remember that the darkness isn't always evil. Sometimes it's just the absence of light, and the smallest candle can push it back." Chloe hugged her fierce and tight, a child's embrace that held no reservation or fear, and whispered in her ear, "Thank you for saving me. You're not a monster, no matter what you think. Monsters don't have friends, and you have us now." Then she was gone, climbing into Jennifer's car, waving goodbye through the window as they pulled away toward Orlando and ordinary life, and the difficult, beautiful work of healing from trauma. The five of them stood in the gas station parking lot, watching the car disappear, and Evangeline felt the weight of 247 years settle on her shoulders in a new way. It wasn't lighter exactly, but it was distributed differently, shared among people who'd chosen to stand with her despite the danger, despite the impossibility of what they were attempting. The curse still bound her to the swamp, still made her something other than human, but for the first time since 1776, she had something she'd thought forever lost. She had companions. She had a purpose beyond mere survival. She had, against all odds and logic, hope. "So," Samuel said, breaking the contemplative silence, "where do we start? What's our first move in building this supernatural defense network?" Evangeline considered the question, her mind already cataloguing the threats she knew about, the places where the veil between normal and supernatural was thin, the people who might be in danger from forces they couldn't see. "We start with research," she decided. "We start by documenting everything I know and everything you've experienced. We build a database, a repository of knowledge that can outlast any of us. Then we start reaching out carefully to others who might have encountered the supernatural and survived. We find the people who've been marked by darkness and offer them what I never had: guidance, protection, community." "I know a place," Marcus offered. "A warehouse in Fort Lauderdale that's been abandoned for years. The owner died and there's some kind of legal dispute over the estate. We could use it as a base of operations, at least temporarily. I could draw up plans for renovations, incorporate your protective wards into the structure itself." Isabella nodded enthusiastically. "And I can start mapping supernatural activity. My visions aren't random. There are patterns, places where the dead congregate, locations that attract entities like the one we faced. If we can identify these hotspots, we can potentially intervene before people get hurt." "I'll document everything," Darren said, his filmmaker's mind already envisioning how to structure the knowledge they'd gather, not for public consumption, not yet, but as a training tool, as evidence, as a way to help future recruits understand what they're getting into. Samuel pulled out a worn notebook, the kind detectives had used before everything went digital, and began making lists. "We'll need protocols, procedures, rules of engagement. We'll need to establish what threats we can handle, and which ones require retreat. We'll need contingency plans and safe words and dead man switches. This can't be a suicide mission. It has to be sustainable." Evangeline listened to them plan, watched them take her lonely crusade and transform it into something bigger, something that might actually make a lasting difference, and she felt tears prick at her eyes for the second time in as many days. Crying had seemed pointless after the first century of her curse, an indulgence her dead body couldn't spare the moisture for. But apparently, her emotional capacity wasn't as dead as she'd believed. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of centuries of isolation finally breaking. "Thank you for not running, for not writing me off as a monster or a mad woman. Thank you for choosing to stand with me." "You saved our lives," Marcus pointed out practically. "This is the least we can do." But Isabella shook her head, understanding what Evangeline meant on a deeper level. "You gave us purpose. We were all lost last night, all of us circling the drain in our own ways. You showed us that there's more to the world than we knew, that there are battles worth fighting even if nobody ever knows you fought them. That's worth everything." They piled into Marcus's car, miraculously still parked at a trailhead where he'd left it before attempting his ill-fated escape into the Everglades, and headed toward Fort Lauderdale, toward the beginning of something new. Evangeline sat in the back seat, watching the landscape scroll past through windows that framed a world she'd forgotten how to be part of, and she marveled at the strangeness of it all. She'd spent 247 years believing she was meant to be alone, that her curse isolated her by design, that redemption required solitary suffering. But maybe she'd been wrong. Maybe the real curse had been her belief that she didn't deserve connection, that she had to carry her burden alone. Maybe the real magic, the real power, wasn't in knowing names or walking on water or standing against ancient evil. Maybe it was in the simple human act of reaching out and letting others reach back. The warehouse Marcus had mentioned was everything he'd promised. Large, structurally sound despite years of neglect, and best of all, isolated enough that their strange activities wouldn't draw unwanted attention. They spent the rest of the day exploring the space, their voices echoing in the cavernous interior, and Evangeline found herself caught up in their enthusiasm, their plans, their absolute certainty that they could make this work. She walked the perimeter, identifying the best places for protective wards, explaining to Marcus how the symbols needed to be placed and why. Isabella wandered through with her eyes unfocused, seeing things the others couldn't, marking locations where the supernatural had left its impression on the physical world. Samuel and Darren took measurements and photographs, documenting everything with the precision of professionals who knew that details mattered. As the sun set on their first full day together, painting the Fort Lauderdale sky in shades of orange and purple, the five of them sat on the warehouse floor, sharing pizza from a local place that delivered without asking questions about why they wanted food sent to an abandoned building. The conversation flowed easily, moving from serious discussion of their mission to lighter topics, to jokes and laughter that felt like a balm on wounds Evangeline hadn't realized still bled. She watched them, these people who'd stumbled into her life by accident and chosen to stay by design, and she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, the next 247 years wouldn't have to be as lonely as the first had been. "I have a confession," Evangeline said as the pizza box grew empty and the comfortable silence of companionship settled over them. "I don't actually know if I can do this. Leave the swamp, I mean. Not just physically, I proved I can manage that today, but emotionally, psychologically. It's been my whole world for so long that I'm not sure I remember how to be part of the regular world. I don't know how to have friends or colleagues or whatever it is we're building here. I'm going to make mistakes, probably terrible ones. I'm going to default to isolation because that's what I know. I'm going to struggle with trusting people because everyone I ever trusted before 1776 is long dead." "Then we'll help you learn," Samuel said simply, his matter-of-fact tone suggesting this was obvious and barely worth stating. "The same way you'll help Isabella learn to control her visions, the same way you'll help Marcus build structures that can withstand supernatural assault, the same way you'll help Darren document the truth without getting himself killed. We're all learning here. That's the whole point. Plus," Isabella added with a grin, "you've had 247 years to get good at being alone. We'll give you at least a week to get good at having friends before we start complaining." The laughter that followed was genuine and warm, and Evangeline felt something inside her that had been frozen for centuries begin to thaw. It would be a long process, she knew, learning to be part of a community again, learning to trust and be trusted, learning to live instead of merely existing. There would be setbacks and struggles, moments when the curse pulled her back toward isolation, nights when the entity called from the swamp, and she wondered if it wouldn't be easier to just surrender. But for the first time since she'd stood in the Everglades in 1776 and asked for power she didn't understand, Evangeline had something more powerful than magic or immortality or the ability to know names. She had people who cared whether she succeeded or failed, who would notice if she disappeared, who would fight to bring her back if she got lost in the darkness. The warehouse became their headquarters over the following weeks, transformed from abandoned shell to functional base of operations through a combination of Marcus's architectural expertise, Evangeline's magical protections, and everyone's willingness to work 16-hour days. They scoured supernatural lore, interviewed people who'd had paranormal experiences, built a network of contacts and informants across Florida and beyond. Samuel brought his detective skills to bear, creating databases and cross-referencing reports, finding patterns in what had seemed like random supernatural activity. Isabella's visions became more focused, more useful, as Evangeline taught her the meditation techniques she'd learned over centuries of dealing with unwanted magical input. Darren produced a documentary that was equal parts warning and training manual, footage of their Everglades encounter edited into something that could educate without exploiting. And Marcus designed safe rooms and protective structures, places where people threatened by the supernatural could find refuge. They saved their first person together 3 weeks after leaving the swamp, a teenage boy in Tampa who'd made a deal with something he thought was an angel, but was actually far worse. Evangeline felt his name bloom in her consciousness, the way she had with countless others over the centuries. But this time, when she went to intercede, she didn't go alone. The 5 of them descended on Tampa like a supernatural SWAT team, their complementary skills allowing them to extract the boy from his bargain without anyone dying. The gratitude in his parents' eyes, the relief in knowing they'd prevented a tragedy instead of just documenting one, was better than any magic Evangeline had ever performed. The pattern repeated again and again, each rescue building their confidence and refining their techniques. They learned to work as a team, to anticipate each other's moves, to trust that someone would cover the gaps in their defense. They also learned their limitations, the cases they couldn't solve, the people they couldn't save, and those failures hurt in ways that Evangeline hadn't experienced when she'd worked alone. When you had no one to share your grief with, sorrow became just another form of numbness. But sharing failure with people who cared, who felt the losses as deeply as she did, somehow made it both more painful and more bearable. Chloe visited every other weekend, Jennifer bringing her to Fort Lauderdale for what they told social services were counseling sessions, but what actually involved the girl learning about the supernatural world she'd been pulled into. Evangeline taught her protection rituals, basic wards, how to recognize when something was wrong with the world around her. But more importantly, she taught her how to be a child again, how to play and laugh and dream despite the trauma she'd experienced. Watching Chloe heal, watching her transform her grief into strength, was perhaps the most powerful magic Evangeline had witnessed in all her long years. The entity didn't forget them, of course. It couldn't, bound to Evangeline as she was to it, and periodically it would test their defenses, sending minor threats against the warehouse or attempting to lure one of them back to the swamp. But each time, the 5 of them stood firm, their combined will proving stronger than any individual assault. Evangeline began to understand that maybe the curse couldn't be broken in the traditional sense, couldn't be dissolved or destroyed, but it could be transformed. Her knowledge of names, her connection to the supernatural, her immortality, these things that had been weapons turned against her, could become tools for protection, for helping others avoid her fate. 6 months after leaving the swamp, Evangeline stood on the warehouse roof watching the sunrise paint Fort Lauderdale in shades of gold and rose, and she allowed herself to feel something she'd thought lost forever. She felt alive. Not in the technical sense. Her heart still beat sluggishly, her body still existed in the liminal space between death and life, but in the ways that mattered. She had purpose beyond survival, connections beyond transaction, hope beyond mere endurance. The curse remained, would always remain, but it no longer defined her entire existence. She was Evangeline Devereux, witch and protector, cursed and blessed, alone and beloved, and she was finally, after 247 years, becoming something more than the sum of her mistakes. The door to the roof opened and the others emerged, carrying coffee and pastries and the easy camaraderie of people who'd faced death together and chosen life. They'd become her family in a way she hadn't had family since the 1700s, chosen rather than born into, strengthened by shared purpose rather than shared blood. Samuel's cancer had stabilized, a minor miracle that the doctors couldn't explain, but that Evangeline suspected had something to do with the protective magic that now permeated the warehouse, extending lifespan in subtle ways. Isabella had started dating a girl she'd met at a coffee shop, someone normal and sweet who knew nothing about the supernatural and didn't need to. Marcus was slowly working through his legal troubles, using skills he'd learned fighting supernatural threats to fight the very human consequences of his fraud. And Darren had started a podcast, carefully disguising their real cases as fiction while teaching listeners how to recognize genuine supernatural danger. Morning meeting, Marcus suggested, holding up a bag from their favorite bakery. We've got 3 new cases to review, and Isabella had another vision last night that we should probably discuss. Plus, Darren added with a grin, it's Evangeline's anniversary. 248 years ago today, she made a terrible decision that ultimately led to her saving countless lives, including ours. I think that deserves celebration. Evangeline felt emotion tighten her throat, surprised as always when they remembered details about her, when they treated her cursed existence as something worth acknowledging rather than something to politely ignore. You looked up the date of my transformation. Of course we did, Isabella said, as if this were obvious. You're part of the team. We celebrate each other's important days, even when those days are complicated. She pulled out a small cupcake with a single candle. We didn't think 248 candles would fit, so we went symbolic. The gesture was so simple, so humanly normal, that Evangeline found herself crying for what must have been the dozenth time since meeting these people, her emotional capacity apparently undead after all. She blew out the candle, making a wish the way Chloe had taught her, and looked at the faces of her found family gathered on the roof of a warehouse in Fort Lauderdale, watching the sun rise on another day of fighting darkness and protecting the innocent. This, she thought, this was what redemption looked like. Not grand gestures or final battles, not the destruction of evil or the breaking of curses, but the quiet daily work of choosing light, of standing together, of turning wounds into wisdom and mistakes into meaning. Okay, she said, accepting the coffee Marcus handed her and settling into the comfortable rhythm of their morning meetings. Let's review those cases. And Isabella, tell us about your vision. We've got work to do. Because that was the thing about redemption, she'd learned. It wasn't a destination you reached, but a direction you traveled. Not a single moment, but an accumulation of choices. Not something you earned in isolation, but something you built with others. She'd spent 247 years paying for one night of desperate magic. But maybe, just maybe, she'd spend the next 247 years proving that curses could be transformed, that monsters could become protectors, and that knowing someone's name before they spoke, it could be a gift of protection rather than a weapon of control. The swamp still called to her sometimes, the entity still waited in its depths, but Evangeline no longer faced it alone. She had a team, a family, a purpose that extended beyond mere survival into something that looked almost like living. And when she finally returned to the Everglades, because she knew she would return eventually, to face the entity one last time and either break her curse or transform it completely, she wouldn't go alone. She'd go with people who knew her true name, who'd seen her at her worst and chosen to stay, who'd proven that even ancient magic was no match for the simple human decision to care about another person's fate. The sun climbed higher, the day beckoned with its challenges and possibilities, and Evangeline Devereaux, the Witch of the Everglades, smiled. She'd spent centuries knowing names, but only now was she learning what it truly meant to be known, and in that knowledge she'd found something more powerful than any curse. She'd found home.